Whenever a professor attends one of those conferences, sharing a presentation about his or her recent research, summing up all that the professor has been thinking and working towards for months, there is that moment in the presentation where the manuscript is set to the side and the microphone is turned over to the audience for a little Q&A. And you can anticipate serious questions, even scholarly skepticism, where other experts in the room push back on the presentation, seeing things from a different point of view. So you might prepare as much for the Q&A as you do for the presentation, thinking about compelling responses to everything that might be asked. And at one of those conferences, Richard Foster, a writer and speaker on spirituality, who had made some of those presentations himself, was sitting in the audience, listening to a good friend of his, a theologian, offer a brand new perspective, a different outlook on a familiar subject. And there was that moment where the microphone was finally turned over to the audience. And it was the type of presentation that garners and expects serious questions. And sure enough, people started to get up to approach the microphones within the room. The first person who approached the microphone offered more criticism than question. It was more of a statement than anything else. And the theologian stood up there, vulnerable, looking at everybody, looking at him, patiently listening to this criticism offered by an audience member. And finally, and it took a while, the audience member finally sat down and the theologian composed himself, stepped back up to the microphone, took a deep breath and said, "Thank you for your response." Well, Foster was sitting there in the audience, knowing what it feels like to stand on stage, receiving that kind of feedback, and was confused. And since he knew the theologian, he found him afterwards. And in a quiet, secluded corner of the conference center, he asked him, "Why did you not respond to the criticism?" The theologian simply said, "I have been practicing the spiritual discipline of not having to have the last word." And in a world which insists on having the last word, that is quite the discipline. And it seems to line up with the viewpoint of the book of James, where James begins by saying, every generous act of giving is from above. And as we get to the period at the end of that sentence, we might anticipate a conversation that follows that describes God's blessings raining down on earth, or a long paragraph focused on a description of the richness of God's mercy. But instead, James talks about our actions and how our lives can reflect the generosity of God, where we can make room for everyone else in the room, where we are called to be quick to listen and slow to anger. But using words well, it's not always easy. There are those things that have a way of getting tangled up in our words, whether it is anger, miscommunication, snap judgments, assumptions, indignation. It's why James goes on to say that we cannot stand there looking in a mirror and focus on the faults of others, that we need to look in the mirror and examine our hearts. It's why James says we are called to be doers of the word and not merely hearers. And so often, we assume that when we speak up, we are doing something. And on occasion, we are. Anytime we speak up for someone who cannot speak for themselves, we are doers of the word. But just speaking up does not mean we are doing something. It's why Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew that on the day of judgment, we will have to give an account for every careless word that we utter. That we are not called to be speakers of the word, but doers of it. So Jesus invites us to look into this mirror at our hearts. It's like when Jesus and the disciples were caught not washing their hands, which was more than just bad hygiene. Washing hands was a sacred practice. It was a practice of faith. And when they were caught not washing their hands, people got upset. Why do your disciples eat with defiled hands? And Jesus chose his words carefully. In fact, he leans on the words of the prophet Isaiah. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrine. That Isaiah was pointing out how the people's words did not reflect generous hearts. And what matters are our hearts. We cannot wash our hands and treat others poorly and call it faithful. We cannot love God without loving our neighbor. We cannot be speakers of the word and not doers of it. And if we try to use our words well, they can become an opportunity to shape our hearts. That we should not speak solely based on what we know, as if we can speak for everybody else. That we should not say more than we can really say about others. It's like the two friends, as Philip Gulley says, driving through a beautiful countryside, a slow, winding road, and they didn't have anywhere they had to be quickly, so they decided to pull off on the side of the road and take it all in. Beautiful blue sky, sun pouring down. They peered over this fence into this wide pasture, and they noticed up on the hill was a flock of sheep. And for two city boys, they were pretty interested. And one of them said, "It looks like those sheep have been recently shorn, where all the wool had been shaved off of them." And the other one, practicing careful speech, said, well, at least this side of them. I know it sounds odd, but they couldn't see the other side of the sheep to know for sure. And when we look at the lives of others, we cannot assume to know what we cannot know. That we are to be quick to listen, which fosters in us generous hearts. I remember one 4th of July, we were gathered with family friends, and they brought this huge bag of bottle rockets. And all of our eyes got really big, and we got really excited. Bottle rockets shoot up off in the air and then have this loud pop. And I remember standing there lined up as all the children receiving the mandatory safety briefing. It's like the first day of lab class where they issue your eye protection and make you sign at the bottom line all of these safety rules so no one burns down the school with a Bunsen burner. And we listened attentively, not wanting to miss our chance to shoot off all these firecrackers. They told us where to set them up. We were to put them in the cracks of this stump so that after we lit the fuse, it wouldn't accidentally fall over and shoot out chaotically. And then after we lit the fuse, we had to run back to a safe distance where they drew this line on the ground we had to stand behind. And we signed at the bottom line of all the rules. And then we shot off all the firecrackers. And everything went well. Till later on that night, somebody said they smelled smoke. We all dismissed it. It's probably the neighbor barbecuing on the back deck. But an hour went by and the smell persisted. So all the kids wandered out back to find this stump completely engulfed in flames. It looked like the bonfire before the Friday night game. So we hollered out for all the parents, and they came running, absolutely hysterical. One of them grabbed the fire extinguisher and put out the fire. That apparently the tiny, small embers from the bottle rockets had fallen down into the cracks of the stump. And as they continued to smolder, the stump eventually caught on fire. And our words might seem rather small, but they are quite powerful. That we are to be slow to anger and quick to listen so that we can use words well. Because the more we use words well, the more we foster in us generous hearts. Amen.